You are listening to Action Design, your monthly insight into the field of behavioral economics and its applications to the world around us. We bring you leading practitioners from all industries to discuss cutting-edge behavioral research and how to practically apply those concepts to the development of consumer products and public policy.
Well, hello and welcome to another exciting episode of Action Design Radio. I'm Zarak Khan, joined as always by my co-host Erik Johnson.
Hello, everyone.
And we are very lucky and very excited to have with us today Kristen Berman.
Hello. That was I'm already awkward. It's okay.
So, really excited for this conversation. We're going to be talking about what it means to be a behavioral product manager. But before we get into that, Kristen, maybe if you want to tell us and the listeners a little bit about yourself, your background, kind of how you got into behavioral science in the first place.
Great. So I study human behavior and have started actually my journey at Intuit. I was a product manager at Quicken Online and then QuickBooks, and moved into the behavioral science field after kind of hearing Dan Ariely speak and just falling in love with the kind of what I thought was at that time the missing pieces of the product manager's toolkit. And then moved into working with him, started the behavioral science group at Google with Dan Ariely, and we also founded Irrational Labs, which is a nonprofit behavioral science consulting group, which does a lot of things from health, wealth, and happiness, research and consulting. And now co-founded Common Sense, which is a behavioral science group out of Duke. And we primarily think about financial decisions. So how do you get folks to save a little bit more, spend a little bit less, all around kind of helping people make the decisions that are hard for us in the short term, but good for us in the long run around our money. Yeah,
and I guess I'll use that as an opportunity to plug as well. If you haven't already listened to, we recorded an episode with Marielle Beasley, who is your co-director, I guess, at Common Sense Lab a couple months ago, which was a great conversation. So if you guys are interested in learning more about Common Sense Lab, which you should be, take a listen to that as well.
Better be.
We also just, as a plug for we just released a 226-page report. So that could be weekend reading material for folks, but it chronicles the 38 projects that we did this year in 2017 and alludes to some of the ones we did in the past as well.
Oh, I have the page open in my browser as we speak.
As do I, actually. So. Happy Friday. Let's go.
Yeah, gearing up for an exciting Friday night. So, yeah, I mean, you have this incredible background and a ton of great experience. And I kind of felt like looking through that and just from some of our previous conversations, I could see, how you were able to pull together all these thoughts on what it means to be a behavioral product manager. But I was kind of curious, just, in your own words, like, what was it that prompted you to start, I guess, thinking about that? What were your experiences that led to that? And then eventually, your decision to write that article.
Maybe before you start, we should be clear to people that there is an article they need to read in case they haven't. About behavioral product managers by Kristen. So.
Yeah, we'll link to that when we post this.
We'll link to it, but I think if you search behavioral product manager, it should come right up.
Yeah, I'm trying to coin the term. Even had an acronym in there.
Yeah.
So kind of how I started thinking about it was reflecting into my time at Intuit when I was a product manager for Quicken Online. So this is, Quicken Online was prior to Mint. It was a personal financial management tool, had all the fun features that personal financial management tools do, except we were losing the war of personal financial management to Mint. And so the execs kind of came down and told us we needed to make it prettier. Mint at that time was kind of known for its visual aesthetic. And so if you kind of think about this, high up folks come and tell a product team that things need to change. And so what we did was kind of sprint for the next couple weeks, late nights, to make the product very visually appealing, where you'd log in and you'd see all of your finances displayed for you. And this, was what Mint was doing, and we were about to launch this. Before we did that, we had a user feedback session where we brought people into the lab, and Intuit had a very nice user research center, so you could actually see how they were reacting. The whole team was watching as people went through the flow for the first time. And the cool thing was it was almost ready to go, so they were actually looking at their own data. So they would sync their bank account, and then they would be able to see kind of this new visually appealing version of Quicken Online. And so we were all really excited, and the first person does it, and they sync their data, and then they cover their eyes. And it was like they did not want to see what was in front of them. And so the product team, the UX team, and us were like, what the heck? This is crazy. We just spent all this time. It must be just this one person. Let's bring more people into the lab. And more people came into the lab, and the same thing happened, is that every time they would see their money, they would just cover their eyes. And reflecting on this, the product team at the time was really surprised. But if you know anything about behavior, you know that what happened is that they were seeing their money leaving their pockets. And it was a very visually pleasing, clear pie chart that showed what we know as loss aversion. You are now seeing all the money leaving your pockets clearly. And what we know about loss aversion, right, is that people don't like this, and it's an emotionally offensive thing to see. And pile on top of that, there's something called information aversion, where you don't really want to look at the scale if it's not good. And so if, we spent all this time as product people doing something that we as behavioral scientists would say, this is crazy. Why would you do that? And so as product managers, it feels ridiculous that we kind of go into the world without the toolkit of behavioral science. And every day you have people product managers just making things up. That's a strong word, but based on kind of intuitions, when there's so many insights out there from the behavioral science world that can be used. So long story short, I was very frustrated reflecting on this. And as soon as you learn about these concepts, it becomes very clear that there's a massive gap in the product development world that doesn't look at them.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the folks that I've spoken with, the product managers that I talk to, they're really intrigued by behavioral science once they learn about it. And there's a lot of excitement about how it could potentially apply to their work, but maybe naturally just some questions about how can I go about becoming how can I become a BPM, to use the acronym? How can I become a behavioral product manager? Can you I don't know, give a little bit of guidance to folks who are thinking about how they can start infusing more of this sort of behavioral mindset or outlook as they're working on their products? Yeah.
So I think you're calling a gap that we really have in kind of the behavioral world, where there's no real training for applied people. And so I think we're not going to solve that immediately. We do a lot of workshops and things to help with that, because, you either get a PhD, or what I did was learn from a professor. So I think that's a gap that we should fill quickly. But I think from a practical perspective of what folks can do now, when we were at Google, we created this, we were teaching all these heuristics to people and cognitive bias, and it just got very overwhelming very quickly, and people would forget. And that's when we started, calling this the 3B framework. I don't know how much readers are familiar with this, but it basically just tries to narrow down the field of behavioral science. And most teams have some, if you work in behavioral science, have some framework, but ours is just, pretty similar. And we say, focus on a key behavior, eliminate all of the barriers, and then increase the benefits. And so we call this the 3Bs. And I think the main thing that product managers should spend more time on is the first one, is figuring out what behavior to focus on. Because most of the time, the whole organization pushes people towards outcomes, like engagement, active use, logging in, revenue. And as a product person trying to design a product that gets someone to do something, we kind of forget this crazy rigorous focus that we have on revenue, and we need to put on behavior. And the right behavior. So So I think my first advice would be think about what's the right behavior to focus on, and then we do something called behavioral mapping, which is basically outlining every single step that goes into a process, and meticulously looking at where's the friction that comes in this process. And this is kind of an alternative to some of the typical toolkit that product managers use, which is like persona creation, focus groups, interviews. In the behavioral world, you focus much more on what people do versus what they say. And so I think getting really good at mapping out what people do is a critical skill.
Yeah, one example I can think of like that, there's a couple of things that do that. And as I was rereading the article, I was kind of noticing it's like it is a lot different thinking of the behavior that someone like does within the product and ultimately achieves versus some more the more like technical aspects that like you tend to get measured. Like we always try to push, or I try to think about like there's kind of our business outcome, but there's like the user outcome, and ultimately the user outcome will drive that will drive a business outcome in the end of the day if they're not getting done what they want to get done. So like is some of it just like expanding to think just more from the user's perspective to measure things from like their point of success and past more like arbitrary measures, like a lot of times we'll talk about things like jobs to be done or something like that, and it kind of gets past that to like the actual action they're taking and like the real world outcome that happens.
Yeah, I think so. I think what I typically hear though is just like people thinking about logging in and active use as the main thing that you're driving people to do. And I think this actually, we get distracted with this. So it is like a customer outcome where you want to get people to log in or get them to use the product because the product's good for them. But I think when we focus on that, and many times you just have the wrong incentive. So like, again, I'll give an example of QuickBooks Online. When I was there, we wanted to increase active use. Now this is very silly, right? If you're an accounting program, why do you want more people to use it? You actually want it to go away. If I was doing my job correctly, people would never have to log in. Their accounting would be done correctly without them having to worry and without them having to think about it, and spend the least time possible on it. So I think that's more where I'm getting at is I think when we start focusing on the outcome measures, whether it be customer like login or active use or revenue, we just forget like actually to deliver on the mission that most companies have signed up for. We need to get more specific on the actual like behaviors that people are doing. So, we're working with a company, EarnUp, and they try to get people to pay their debts. And so the behavior they want people to do is actually just to, A, sign up, but B, choose a version of EarnUp that then you pay your debt or you pay your loan at the point that you get paid. And by doing that, you actually accelerate your debt payment because most people, 70% of people are paid weekly or biweekly. And so you'll have an extra Friday and then you'll pay a little bit more on your loan. And they don't have any behavior metrics around logging in, which is great, or any outcome metrics on logging in. It's really the one-time sign-up flow to get you to make the right decision to accelerate your debt payment. And then they've helped you basically save years of interest and years off your loan.
Yeah, one of the pieces that I really liked, I think it was maybe like kind of the closing piece of the article, was on like focusing on not just like what sort of like what money or what metrics can I sort of like extract from somebody, but like how can I align this product so that it's lined up or centered with somebody's long-term goals as well. And I was curious though, like if that is if that's ever like a hard sell, like when you're at a company or when you're developing a product to say like, hey, like, yeah, we're, the metrics that we have been using around like, keeping people plugged in. I think the example that you gave in the article was like, a game that you're playing on your phone where like you're essentially just kind of like wasting your time. Is there, while that's maybe in a short-term sense valuable to the company, how have you been successful in like convincing folks to kind of shift from that short-term perspective to thinking more long-term and being more aligned with what's better for the end user in the long term as well?
Yeah. So this is kind of a Tristan Harris time well spent question as well. Is like, and the theory there is just we are what we measure. And so, most people most companies are measuring short-term metrics. And the theory is that those align with revenue and profit and the things that make a company go round. And they do for many times, especially in our, if you think about why apps are incentivized to get you to click and log in and use them. One theory is that it's because their revenue is generated from ads. And so there's, if you don't log in, if you create this, wonderful experience where it's set and forget and you're thinking about the long-term user and you're respecting their time, then you don't have really a business model. Right. And so I think so that comes back to more of an incentive question of saying, like, can you design a revenue model that doesn't require you to measure yourself on short-term outcomes? Mm-hmm. So when we talk to companies, it's mostly we think about what is their revenue model and is that encouraging them to do right by the customer? We love that Digit went to a fee to charging people. Yeah. Because, even though, we think so much about low-income consumers, the reality is that if they don't go to a fee, then their incentive structure is such that they're going to get people to take credit cards that they don't want or, referrals or mortgages. And this is just not the world we want to live in. And so, I think it's an incentive question.
Yeah, I was I was a defender of Digit when they did that as well. I saw like a bunch of articles where it was like, oh, like, yeah, like this used to be a good product, but then they started charging for it. It was like, the way that I look at it is like, for $2 a month, I get to buy all this savings that I would not have otherwise.
Yeah, I feel the same. It's interesting because like the alternatives, like you said, like eventually they've got to make money, and like just charging, you paying a couple dollars a month is a much more ethical way of doing that than trying to get you to sign up for products that you might not really need. It's right. The same thing with like, just like you were talking about, like social media companies and stuff where it's like, oh, it's free, this is great. And of course there's backlash they charge. But at the same time, like when you're not paying for it, like you're the product, and that just misaligns right. incentives. And no matter how well-meaning you are, like eventually you'll sort of like, this is interesting because I think there's a bigger conversation. There's becoming a much bigger. You mentioned like Tristan Harris, and he's been kind of like leading this, but there's becoming a lot bigger conversation now about how addicted we are to tech and stuff like that. And a lot of it is just, it's not that like these people making a lot of these products are like evil or something, but when you have incentives to just get people engaged and always be using something, it's just you're naturally like over time you'll keep like doubling down on that, and it sort of gets to a point where it's kind of too much. So like. So it is important to take that extra step, and like for whatever reason, like just psychologically, like we always know that behaviorally we gravitate towards what's easy most of the time, and it's the same thing. And think about these like metrics and things like that. Is like when we come to think about how we measure our performance, like like logins is easy to measure, like time on page is easy to measure, stuff like that. But it's a lot harder to think about how you measure like are they actually paying down their debt? Are they doing this thing that they want to do? And it's like it's just a behavioral challenge. Like think past that obvious. First thing that might not be what you really need.
Yeah. And I think you bring up a good point of like, it is hard to measure. And that's, I think, where like a behavioral product manager would prioritize measurement in experimental infrastructure sooner than a normal product manager would, with the realization that you can't really move a company towards a consumer outcome if you're not measuring it. And so like the infrastructure of data and how you're measuring it and what you're testing is required if you're going to move the company from the salient metrics of login and retention and revenue. You have to be able to measure it.
Yeah, that was actually a question I had. When I was reading, I was thinking about it. It's like, what is so? And think about. I really like that you pointed that out. That like a behavioral PM will pause new features coming out to get that infrastructure in place and prioritize that because that's so important. Like, what does that infrastructure look like generally? So, like, I work a lot more in like the marketing world, and a lot of that stuff, usually it's like, using stuff like Optimizely to like do a measure on landing pages and like, but sometimes products can be a little more, especially in mobile apps or, not native apps and stuff like that. Like, what is that kind of infrastructure like typically? And, what type of investment is that for a BPM to get there?
Yeah. I think this is a gap. Maybe, and this would be great if any listeners have better technology out there. But what we typically find is a strong kind of IKEA effect of people. I don't know if this is the wrong use of IKEA effect, so I'll stand corrected. But the idea that we like it, companies just want to build their own stuff. And so what's happening is it's homegrown. You'll get basically like companies that are, we found that like it's about Series A, Series B, that they're figuring out that they need more data capabilities and infrastructure and experimental framework. And there's nothing really off the shelf that they're comfortable using or that we've seen. And we've really pushed them to like, how can you push the boundaries of Optimizely? But the reality is that they're building the randomizer themselves. They're building they're using, Tableau or whatever to display data, but it's all kind of like hacked together, which is really tough because then you'll have to build something else when you scale more. So we haven't found that companies are using any consistent off-the-shelf software. I think it's a great market opportunity because engineers are just spending way too much time doing it, building the homegrown stuff and then testing it.
Yeah, that's what I've noticed more on the product side is that there is a lot more homegrown stuff that you kind of got to put in yourself. So like it would seem. So yeah, to listeners out there, if you're feeling ambitious, see if you can build that solution for us.
Or maybe there's stuff out there that I don't know about. So I think that'd be great to find that there's nice new apps that are a little bit more robust and behind the server than Optimizely.
Yeah.
I was wondering. So I sent this article around to a bunch of my team at Merits, and I've been like meeting with a lot of the product managers there. And so when we scheduled this, I sent a follow-up to that crew and was like, hey, that article that we all loved? I'm chatting with her this week. And one of the questions that they had was around, like, if you're somebody who's managing a team of product managers who are, let's say, making the transition to being behavioral product managers, like, how do you evaluate, like, the performance of a behavioral product manager versus a traditional product manager? Is it sort of like drawn from the metrics that you would set, kind of for yourself, like within the product, or is it or is it just not that different necessarily from how you would normally evaluate someone's performance?
Yeah, great question. So I think at the end of the day, the product managers are usually evaluated on, the customer outcomes and business outcomes. So I'd say I don't want to vary too much and say dramatically we should change how we evaluate success here. I think because we are not great as a product management community at measuring customer outcomes, I think actually the BPM would get more love for doing this. I think experiments are definitely one. So how many experiments you're doing and if they actually test like the big objectives. So I'm not a proponent for testing everything. I am a proponent for thinking about what your biggest company and strategic risk is, and then figuring out a creative way to do quick testing on this and strategic in-product testing. So I think how many experiments you run and are they worth the company's effort and resources? And then the second thing is, how do you get customer insights? So, a lot of our confidence as product managers comes from how we can represent the customer. And a lot of this is just not correct. It's our intuition, right? And so I think with the crutch of behavioral science, we should be requiring people to justify their intuitions a lot more with insights around why people do the things they do and, proof looking around what other people have done and research that already exists. So like before you talk to 10 people, have you done a literature review? you don't have to do it. Somebody else maybe has already done it. And so, the idea that we just let product managers and designers and engineers kind of make up, and create products is a really powerful position to be in. And so I think we should give it the weight that it deserves with we should look around and see what other research is out there before kind of creating or reinventing the wheel.
Yeah, I think that totally agree. And yeah, it's one of the things that I think our team, like our behavioral science team, tries to kind of serve in that role of like when folks have questions or think that there might be some potential application of behavioral science, then they can kind of like reach to us. Because we sort of I think are also trying to move away from like the notion of like everyone should just have like a poster with all the different heuristics on it, like at their desk and like pull it out of a hat and see which one fits in, right? So it's more of like a process. And part of the process is like you don't necessarily have to be like a PhD in behavioral science, right? You can start with some of like, like the 3 Bs or East framework or whatever framework, you kind of have within your own company or organization. And then, you can, reach to other experts who have kind of been there before or, have already done a literature review or something like that. I think that makes total sense to me as well.
The other thing that Kelvin Kwong, who former Jawbone, he did with his team is basically gave away our workbooks, which we have like 10 workbooks go through different principles, and had the team just have discussion on them every week, which then was like kind of a way to chunk like, okay, how would we use social proof in the product? And it helped really create a shared language that the team was using. And so that, because you as a product manager, it's great if you know behavioral science and understand this, but actually your job is more as the leader of the product to infuse this within the copywriters and the designers and the engineers. And so I think a lot of it is kind of creating the shared language as well, so that you don't have to have this like, the wheel of heuristics.
Right.
So one thing I was kind of wondering is like sort of like the evolution of this coming to like the BPM. Like you've worked with a lot of, there's probably, I can't think of anybody else that probably has worked with so many different product teams or different companies and probably seen this sort of like evolution happen in some way. So I was curious about just kind of the history of this. Like, have you seen any consistent changes like within your experience within kind of the tech industry of like some of this becoming more and more common? Like, are there certain things that have become more common as time's gone on, and maybe how has that changed over time, or how have your kind of like thoughts of what this kind of BPM model looks like been kind of evolved through your experiences and over the years?
Yeah, I kind of thought that we would land on a behavior, like we'd have a role in a company called a behavioral scientist. I thought that that's the model we would land on as kind of a tech or a community of product people, because I was hoping that you'd have somebody who would be kind of move from researcher, which is typically like in big companies even still qual and focus groups, to the behavioral scientist, which is incorporating quantitative research, kind of an observational, like say versus do, and much more of the wider breadth of the academic community. I moved away from that recently after talking to a few HR managers and saying like, what will happen? Like, we have this huge field of behavioral science. It's wildly helpful to people who create new things in the world, new features. How will these worlds match up? And he just was like, the main one that I remember was like, he runs a recruiting company. Like, it's never going to happen. And I was like, what?
That's an amazing insight.
What do you mean? And he's like, because the HR folks need a rec for it. They need, they're not hiring for a behavioral science person. And so you have to get the HR person to create another role for that. And to do that, you have to go through the manager. And so he thought that basically the chain of events would just be too difficult to do. And I mean, I tend to agree, because we don't, again, as we started this conversation, we have no training ground for applied applied behavioral scientists. So there's really very little places for people to go and get an education outside of a couple-day workshop. So basically I was like, well then how should behavioral science, who should be responsible for this? And like most things in the product world, the product manager is the person whose head's on the line for delivering a product that, that meets the business and the customer needs. So I think it's a logical spot to say that it should transition from, just like marketing transition to growth, quote unquote, I'm using quotes, you can't see me, quote, growth marketing. The product manager should transition to become a behavioral product manager that's in charge of behavior change.
Yeah, I mean, I think it reflects a conversation that we've had a bunch, like in a lot of different action design venues around like how would you structure that in an organization? Like, do you have like one person who's like your behavioral scientist that kind of floats around? Do you have like some, everyone has some degree of expertise in it? And I think everyone has different opinions on it, and there's different models that have been successful, but I think in most cases people kind of advocate for sort of a bit of like a hybrid model, right? And I think that the behavioral product manager makes total sense as like a key part of that hybrid model where they are the right sort of level and decision maker to like be a key influencers of sort of driving and infusing, behavioral science across an organization. Yeah, and I think the other opportunity here is kind of a behavioral designer, like the person who pushes the pixels is going to be also the person maybe who changes our behavior the most. So I think if we think about a secondary opportunity to infuse behavioral science, it's could be a designer, but yeah, I also think this idea of, the chief behavioral officer is very nice. I just don't know how that can scale down to more junior folks, without creating kind of new roles across the organization. So,
I know like on our side, we have a behavioral team at Morningstar, and like the way we've sort of, we have expanded to an extent, but we've started more looking at it as growing our team is more getting more people that's involved doing this stuff across the company, like which has always kind of been our goal anyway, but it's just kind of become more a stark goal where like we're not really going to necessarily invest in just hiring direct people for our team, but making sure there's other people that are an active part of doing the BPM type of role and things like that throughout the company, and that's how it really scales. That's how it really should scale, because like a lot's just like when you read your article and you're like, this just makes total sense, like that this should just be kind of part of that kind of product manager workflow. So, and also from an HR perspective, that just makes more sense to sort of change the talent stack to an extent of what maybe is required or you look for in people like that to understand and think like that, rather than try to create like a whole separate role. It's just a little more complicated. It's more kind of expanding on that existing stack.
Yep.
Yeah, we've played around with that as well. I mean, so obviously we at Nerds have chief behavioral officer, and then her team, which is where I am, we kind of serve as a center of excellence across the different companies. I think it's a little bit different at Merits in the sense that they've sort of, across the organization said like we all should be doing behavioral science, and so that it's like this is like a key differentiator for the company, right? So so everyone kind of I think feels like they have a part in that, and so I think that we've adopted some of the same model of kind of what you're describing, Erik, of everyone sort of figuring out how it fits into or to what extent it fits into their role, and how they can start kind of getting more up to speed with it, or applying it more often or more rigorously. And so that's why I was excited when I saw your article and was like, I think I sent it out to our team, and then somebody else had already seen it. Somebody else had already like sent it around, and then a few other people sent it back. They were like, "Oh, hey, have you seen this? Like this?" Yeah, it was totally.
Wow,
At least on the Merritt's campus, it was very viral.
Nice.
So, like, building on that though, thinking, we've talked a little bit about our experience, but given what you've seen, are there any like examples of particular companies or particular like product managers you work with or know pretty well that are sort of already fitting this model that can maybe be sort of like case studies for how this might work?
Yeah. I've mentioned Kelvin now. This is my second or third time on this call, but he really is. He's really wonderful, and he's been at Jawbone, and now he's at, I think it's Sleepio, and he's kind of putting into practice some of the behavioral thinking and infusing not only it within how he thinks about product requirements, but really making it a priority to do the data capture and the infrastructure building and cult out his team in behavioral science. And develop new products, you kind of using some of the behavioral science methodologies. So I think he is definitely one. I'm also a big fan of Chris York. He's a freelance designer, but acts much more as a product manager and has kind of touched a lot of products. And so he has a strong point of view. I think his strong point of view is like, if it's not as in the 3B model, it has to be easy and it has to be appealing, like reduce barriers, increase benefits. And Chris is one of the best people for reminding me of this. He's like, if it's not as funny as a cat video, then it's not good enough, and it's kind of a really nice reminder that like, that's what we're competing with, like people have really immediate needs for benefits and a lot of things are calling in their attention. And so we can't pretend that like, people want to save money and that's what they woke up today thinking they would do. We have to fight for the attention. And same with making it easy. So I think he's kind of best in class at trying to get all of the clicks down to as little as possible.
Yeah, it's sort of harkening back to what you had mentioned in the beginning. A lot of this is thinking like we can't just think of the ideal person, what like the ideal, responsible, attentive person would do. It's like we're competing with cat videos. That's the reality. So like, how do you make paying down your debt and saving for retirement and things like that at least somewhat as interesting as watching great cat or dog videos?
Yeah.
So we're getting kind of close to the end of our time here, but I wanted to ask a couple questions, and one of them is we've kind of talked around this a little bit in the sense of how challenging it can be. But one of the questions that we ask most of the guests on the podcast is what advice they would give to folks who are kind of trying to get into behavioral science. And so I know we've talked a little bit about like workshops or like, getting a PhD or, we've asked different folks who have different backgrounds and different levels of experience, just to kind of see how their advice sort of differs, because there's all kinds of different paths to getting into this. So I don't know, what's your take on that?
Yeah. So Rational Labs is going to be launching like a 9 to 10 week course later on. I don't want to commit to when or more details than that, but because of this gap,
Action Design exclusive.
Yeah. But I mean, I think there's, I made an Excel sheet of all the courses out there, and they're just like, most of them are wonderful, but they're too short, 2 days or something for training. So I have no real course recommendations. The way that I got into this is the same way that Evelyn Gosnell, who is a senior researcher at Irrational Labs, and Wendy De La Rosa, who's a principal at Common Sense, did, is we buddied up with a professor. So I buddied up with Dan Ariely, Wendy buddied up with Adam Grant, and Evelyn buddied up with Ayala Kanizi, and just offered a lot of free work. And it's not a fair system, so I don't think that this is a good way to get most people into it. But it definitely, I think it's a nice way. You say you're going to be exposed to a field from the academic perspective first, but you're probably not going to get actually Wendy is getting her PhD, but most people who are going to do that are not going to get their PhD, but you get exposure to the academic side of things before actually jumping into the applied. And I really like that as a philosophy that says this is a more rigorous field that has a lot of history and very smart people and we should learn from the academic rigor kind of before jumping into the shortcuts that the applied world tends to have to take.
Right.
So that'd be my advice: is find a professor and do some free work.
Cool. Yeah.
That'll
Well, and
hustle.
we'll definitely keep an eye out for your upcoming course. That's very exciting.
Yeah.
So what's next for you? What's next for BPM? What are you excited about that you're working on?
So I'll tell you a few things I'm excited about. So Common Sense, we take tech companies and credit unions and nonprofits, and we help them do research to improve their customer well-being around their finances. And so we're currently a few experiments we're working on. I'm pumped about. We're working with NARMI, which is basically the front end to a credit union. So credit unions are notorious for having terrible technology. And so NARMI is basically going to take over that front end and has done that for a fair amount of credit unions. And what we're going to do is what we're hoping to do. Nothing is experiments are very risky and take a lot of time. So the plan is to think about what is successful in our world around savings, which is really automatic enrollment for 401ks. It's kind of the most successful thing we've got, and has gotten people to set aside money for the long term and apply that to banks. So currently, if you go to Bank of America, Charles, all these, I did a diagnosis of all the major banks, and it's like 3 clicks to set up automatic savings. And if you think about the behavioral world, you say, why don't people do anything? It's not because they don't want to, it's because it's difficult. And so what we want to do with NARMI is make it much more like an automatic enrollment process for 401ks, and just make this automatic enrollment for automatic savings. When you sign up for your bank, you're just automatically going to save a little bit. And we're going to try to eliminate some of the barriers to savings as well, which is kind of the uncertainty that you'll have enough money, right? Most Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. And so what we'll do is time the withdrawal with their deposit, so that you're not actually worried about overdraft. And by the way, banks don't offer this right now. So banks only offer, like 2 to 3 options for when you want to do an automatic savings withdrawal, which is just kind of crazy. You say no one really wants a random time for you to just withdraw money. You'd want it withdrawn when you have money.
Right.
And so I'm excited basically to think about that the environment, the reason why America's savings balances are so low is not because people don't want to save. It's because banks and credit unions so far have made it fairly difficult. And so,
are you guys also looking at like adding frictions around like taking money out of savings?
Yeah, so I think we've kind of narrowed on this one that's our second choice.
Right.
So as we only get a few conditions, and so we'll start with the concept of can we compare automatic savings to not automatic savings and automatic savings time with deposits. But the second thing is, yes, can we add some friction to the experience to help people keep it in there and avoid the temptation of taking it. But I think right now we're kind of thinking about, right now banks just do this so terribly that we really want to show that like reducing the amount of friction to savings can help with this. And again, it's not that people don't want to think about their finances. It's just it's not easy right now. So that's one thing. The other one is we're working with AdmitHub. AdmitHub is a system that basically texts college kids before they get to college and helps prevent the summer melt. So summer melt is when people are going from senior to freshman year of college and don't actually attend freshman year of college for whatever reason. Likely because maybe the finances didn't get worked out, or they didn't get the right applications in. And then they're also texting, college students and helping them stay in school. And the crazy thing we learned and we'll start working on is that most of the effort around applications and getting lower income students to go to college and stay in college is around the FAFSA and the first year of the FAFSA. Right. So it's basically, can you get someone who's a high school senior to fill it out? And there's actually a fair amount of support there. And by the way, the FAFSA is, as we know, a terrible form. But there's not much
a
help.
BPM behind the FAFSA right now. For
There
sure.
is not a BPM. By the way, I think if we're to create other roles in society, we should create form designers and just really make this the most prestigious role possible as a form designer.
Yeah.
Yeah. So with Admin Hub, we're thinking about, there's so much focus on the senior to freshman, but almost no focus on the freshman to sophomore, sophomore to junior, junior to senior. And what happens is that students they can stay in school, but then the problem is that there's tons of expenses that happen with college, and most people low income are working 20 plus hour a week. So they're balancing a job to make ends meet, and then and they may not have filled out the FAFSA. And so at that point, then you're already working really hard. You have no ability to work harder, and you don't have the funding. So we're going to try to do a bit more. We'll do more of a behavioral diagnosis on the actual intervention, but we'll be tackling that problem with them.
Awesome. Those are both very exciting.
So how can people stay up to date on those projects and all the other cool things you're working on? What's the best way for them to follow your work and of the the lab?
Just text me. Stuff? Just kidding. My phone number. No,
that'll be a first on the podcast, but I support it.
We told there's a laugh track. That's great. I didn't know you'd have a laugh track.
There you go.
No, I think so. CommonSenseLab.org. We have a newsletter that goes out around our common sense stuff. I'm biased. I think it's very nice. It also includes all the Center for Advanced Hindsight work, which is around health, and all the other projects that Dan Ariely spins up. And then in Rational Labs, we have a fun newsletter that we send out randomly. There's no cadence to it except when we want to share something interesting. And so I would just go to rationallabs.org and you will sign up for this wonderful newsletter. And I'll send you
I subscribe randomly to both, and I will give them my heartiest of recommendations. It's good stuff.
Nice. Wonderful.
Great.
Can I make one more thing on a behavioral product manager? Because I think it's a nice little story.
Absolutely.
Yeah, please do.
And then you guys can edit me out if you like. Okay, so I think what we didn't talk about is paternalism in as much detail as I think PMs need to think through what their opinion is of this. And I'll give you an example. We were working with a large company that does advertising, and they were designing the sign up form for people to start advertising. And in one of these fields, you have to have people pick keywords that go into their ad. And the question that we said was, this is very difficult. You're a florist, and now you have to pick all these keywords that should actually, cause people to click on the ad. And yet you've never done advertising before. And the engineers we were working with were just convinced that the florists would know best. That the florists would know, how could we recommend their keywords? What if they sell tulips? What if they sell roses? We don't know. They obviously know their shop the best for me to recommend. And I think this is highlighting, a behavioral product manager would come in there and say, no. The world is complex. We are experts, and it's our job to make someone's life easier, and it's our job to basically take the burden off of the consumer and, in some respects, do it for them. Now, this is not the case for all things, that you should not always make decisions on behalf of the user. I'm not suggesting that, it's a one and done sort of thing here, but this mentality that it's the user should be able to kind of decide and they know best, I think is one that the typical product manager may come across a lot, and a behavioral product manager would question kind of at what point is it our responsibility to step in and be more proactive and paternalistic and help people do the things that they want to do in the long run but are hard in the short. So that would be my plug, is to think deeply about this as a BPM, and then really try to question the normal way of thinking, which gives the user a lot of control, which people think is good, but may also backfire.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I know sometimes it's like a touchy topic to think about the paternalism aspect, but for me, a heuristic is just what is someone is using your product, they're using it for a reason. So what is that reason? I use let's say like fitness tracker or something, and like the purpose of that is like I want to track more and I want to run more, for example. So like as the product manager, like you shouldn't feel guilty about doing things that like make those decisions to make it easier for people to run more, because that is why they're using your product.
Yep. Yeah. Amen. It's now getting religious. Sorry. We started awkward, and I'm going to end awkward.
The church of the BPM is convenient.
That's right.
I do have a goal to start a mini cult or religion. So if this is it, I'm down.
Oh man, well, your paternalism just took a whole new turn with that.
Oh gosh, edit.
Well, we're always proselytizing for behavioral science, and we already have 501c3 status too. So that's like 2/3 of the things you need as a cult, right? It's like tax exempt and always trying to convince people to follow your way of thinking. I think that we're maybe more aligned on that than it seems at first.
We just need to collect more donations.
Right. Yes.
Right, yeah.
Text your donations to Kristen.
Exactly.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time and chatting with us. We'll post the article as well when we post this podcast. If you haven't already seen it, go and take a look. It's fantastic. Follow Irrational Labs. Follow Action Design, all of our stuff, action-design.org. And we'll talk to you next time. Thanks.
All right.
Amen.
Thanks a lot for joining us. You may go, my children.
Yeah, we definitely should start passing the plate more at the stuff and see what kind of donations we get.
To be continued on that.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening. That concludes this edition of Action Design Radio, hosted by Erik Johnson and Zarak Khan. All podcast episodes are available for download on SoundCloud, YouTube, and iTunes. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Special thanks to Morgan Bortz for design, and as always, we would like to recognize Steve Wendell, founder of the Action Design Network. I am your producer and audio engineer, Zach Simon. For more cutting-edge behavioral science content, visit action-design.org. Once more, that is action-design.org. There, you can sign up for our newsletter and find an in-person event happening near you. We have chapters in over a dozen cities in the United States, plus Toronto. Also, on our website, you can find additional notes and links regarding the topics discussed in today's episode. Once again, thank you for tuning in, and we will see you again soon.